The great chamber of the Galactic Concord stretched for miles in every direction, its walls made of living crystal that hummed with ancient power. And Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood alone at its center, surrounded by beings who had ruled the stars when her ancestors still lived in caves. The HFY High Speaker towered above the assembly, its body a twisted pillar of glowing crystal that pulsed with cold blue light. And when it spoke, the words seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the floor and walls and the very air itself. Humanity stands accused of violating the stasis accords, the High Speaker announced, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the thousands of alien delegates who filled the observation platforms above. Your species has developed weapons technology beyond your sanctioned tier, and this crime cannot be ignored. Elena kept her face calm even as anger burned in her chest, because she knew the accusation was false, and she knew that the Concord knew it was false. But none of that mattered when the verdict had already been decided long before this trial began. Evidence presented against humanity was laughable, consisting of a single research station on a distant moon where scientists had been experimenting with quantum tunneling for faster communication systems. And there was nothing military about the research at all. But the elder races had twisted every fact to paint humanity as a threat. We have reviewed the evidence. The Morthani delegate rumbled from his platform, his massive gray form shifting as he spoke. And we find humanity guilty of treaty violation in the first degree. The Silith representative hissed her agreement, a serpentine body coiling around her speaking pillar as her forked tongue tasted the air with obvious satisfaction at humanity's humiliation. One by one, the other species added their voices to the condemnation, and Elena counted them silently, noting which ones spoke with genuine belief in humanity's guilt and which ones simply followed the crowd, because it was easier than standing alone. Ambassador Chen Wei from the Human Diplomatic Corps caught her eye from the gallery above and gave a small shake of his head, warning her not to lose her temper, because any outburst now would only make things worse for their people. The sentence is as follows, the High Speaker continued, and the chamber fell silent as every being present leaned forward to hear the punishment that would reshape human civilization forever. Humanity is hereby expelled from the Galactic Concord permanently and without possibility of appeal. Elena had expected this, had prepared for it during the long months of political maneuvering that led to this moment. But hearing the words spoken aloud still hit her like a physical blow. Furthermore, the High Speaker went on, all human colonies will be placed under protectorate governance until such time as your species demonstrates the maturity to govern itself. And your military fleet will be dismantled under Concord supervision to ensure compliance with proper technological limitations. The chamber erupted in what passed for applause among the assembled species, a cacophony of clicks and hums and vibrations that expressed approval in 100 different ways. Elena waited for the noise to die down before she spoke. And when she did, her voice carried clearly through the sudden silence that fell across the assembly. May I ask a question before we conclude these proceedings? The High Speaker's crystal form flickered with surprise, because condemned species rarely requested anything beyond mercy at this stage. But ancient protocols required that she be heard. You may speak, the High Speaker allowed. What happens if we refuse? Elena asked, and the words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. What happens if humanity does not accept your judgment and does not surrender our colonies or our fleet? Laughter echoed through the chamber, or at least the alien equivalent of laughter, as dozens of species expressed their amusement at the absurd question. The Morthani delegate leaned forward with what might have been a smile on his craggy face and answered before the High Speaker could respond. Then you will be made to comply by force, he said simply. Your 17 colony worlds cannot stand against the combined fleets of the Concord. and your primitive vessels would be destroyed within hours of any confrontation. So I suggest you accept reality and submit gracefully." Elena nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. But inside her mind was racing through calculations and contingencies that had been prepared months ago when the political winds first shifted against humanity. "I see," she said at last. And then she did something that no condemned species had ever done in the 12,000-year history of the Galactic Concord. She smiled. It was not a smile of surrender or acceptance or even defiance, but something else entirely. Something that made several of the nearer delegates recoil instinctively, even though they could not have explained why. "Thank you for clarifying our options," Elena said pleasantly. "In that case, humanity will take some time to consider its response, and we will see ourselves out." She turned and walked toward the exit without waiting for permission to leave. And the chamber exploded into chaos behind her as delegates shouted questions and demands, and threats that she ignored completely. Ambassador Chen Wei met her at the door with a dozen human security officers who fell into formation around them as they strode through the ancient corridors of the Concord station. That could have gone better, Chen Wei observed quietly as they walked. "Or it could have gone exactly as planned," Elena replied without slowing her pace. "Signal all human personnel on Concord stations to begin emergency evacuation immediately, and tell them to leave nothing behind that could be useful." Within 6 hours, every human diplomat and trader and worker had departed from Concord space, leaving behind empty quarters and silent communication terminals, and confused alien bureaucrats who had never seen a species move so quickly or so decisively. Within 6 days, the quantum relay network went dark on all human frequencies, as Earth cut itself off from the galactic community that had rejected it. The Concord expected surrender within a week, expected humanity to come crawling back with apologies and promises of good behavior, because that was what every other species had done when faced with the overwhelming might of the elder races. They sent messages, demanding compliance and threatening consequences, and they waited for the response that surely must come from a species so young and so weak and so clearly outmatched. But the messages went unanswered, and the days stretched into weeks, and slowly a terrible suspicion began to grow in the minds of those who had orchestrated humanity's expulsion. They had expected to crush a minor nuisance and demonstrate their power to the galaxy once more. They did not yet understand what they had awakened. Admiral Marcus Chun stood on the observation deck of Orbital Station 7 above the colony world of New Singapore, watching through the massive windows as construction drones swarmed around the skeletal frames of warships that had not existed 3 months ago. Behind him, the door opened and Director Yuki Tanaka entered with a tablet clutched in her hands and dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. But there was fire in her gaze that exhaustion could not dim. "The latest production reports," she said without preamble, handing him the tablet. "We have increased output by 40% since last month. But it is still not enough to meet your timeline." Marcus scrolled through the numbers with practiced efficiency, noting the achievements and the shortfalls and the bottlenecks that still needed to be cleared. "The Concord has given us 2 years before they send their peacekeeping fleet," he said quietly. 2 years to build a navy from almost nothing, to train crews, to develop weapons systems that can compete with species who have been making war for longer than humanity has existed. 2 years is not enough time, Yuki replied flatly. "We would need a miracle to be ready in 2 years. Then we have 18 months, Marcus said. And he turned from the window to face her directly. "Because I want to be ready when they arrive." Not scrambling to catch up, Yuki stared at him for a long moment before letting out a breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "You are asking the impossible." "I am asking you to make the impossible happen." he corrected her gently. "And I have seen what you can do when properly motivated." The transformation of human space had already begun before Elena Vasquez returned from the Concorde chamber with news of their expulsion, because the politicians and military leaders had seen the storm coming and started preparations in secret, but those early efforts were nothing compared to what came next. Every shipyard in human territory was converted to military production, and new shipyards were built in hidden asteroid fields and distant moons where Concorde sensors could not easily reach civilian. Freighters were gutted and rebuilt as carriers capable of launching swarms of fighter craft, and mining vessels became ammunition transports carrying weapons that had been designed and manufactured in record time. Universities abandoned their normal research programs and turned their considerable intellects towards solving the problems of war, while students who had planned careers in medicine or art or commerce found themselves learning to pilot warships instead. The elder races had never faced an enemy like this, because they had never needed to. Their technology had remained static for thousands of years, advancing only in tiny increments when absolutely necessary, because change was seen as dangerous and destabilizing and unnecessary. When you already ruled the galaxy, humanity had no such limitations. Dear James, Okonkwo led a team of physicists who cracked the secrets of practical shield harmonics in just 4 months, developing defensive technology that the Concorde had declared theoretically impossible centuries ago. Lieutenant Sarah Reyes captured a damaged Silith patrol craft during a border skirmish and reverse-engineered its drive core, then improved upon the design so significantly that her version was 40% more efficient than the original. A 17-year-old girl on Mars named Wei Lin submitted a weapons targeting algorithm through a public innovation forum, and when the military tested it, they discovered that it outperformed anything in the Concorde arsenal by a factor of 3. Every human became part of the war effort in their own way, not because they were forced to participate, but because they understood what was at stake if they failed. Factories that had made consumer goods now produced armor plating and missile components, and workers who had never thought about military matters learned new skills with desperate determination. Farmers increased their yields to feed the growing military, while artists created propaganda that reminded everyone why they were fighting and what they stood to lose. Children grew up hearing stories of Concorde oppression and learned to hate the elder races who had cast humanity out for the crime of being too innovative and too ambitious and too unwilling to accept a subordinate role in galactic society. The first of the new Titan class battleships launched from the New Singapore orbital yards on a gray morning, when clouds covered the planet below and rain fell on the celebration ceremonies. They named her Defiance because that single word captured everything humanity felt toward those who had tried to crush them. Admiral Chun stood on her bridge for the first time and felt the power humming through the deck plates beneath his feet. The barely contained energy of weapons systems and drive cores and shield generators that represented the absolute cutting edge of human technology. Status report, he ordered quietly. All systems nominal. Commander David Okafor responded from the tactical station. Weapons are online and ready. Shields are holding at full strength, and the drive core is performing above expected parameters. Marcus nodded slowly and looked out through the main view screen at the growing fleet that surrounded them, at the cruisers and destroyers and support vessels that emerged from shipyards every day in numbers that would have seemed impossible just months before. "How many ships do we have now?" he asked. 47 capital ships of various classes, his aide reported. Consulting her tablet, 300 cruisers, over 1,000 destroyers and frigates, and support vessels too numerous to count accurately. It was an impressive achievement by any measure, a testament to human determination and ingenuity and refusal to accept defeat. but Marcus knew it would not be enough. Not against the combined might of the Galactic Concord with their thousands of warships and their millions of years of experience. They needed something more than just ships and weapons. They needed to change the nature of warfare itself. Send a message to all human colonies, he said at last. Tell them the fleet is ready. Tell them we are coming home. And tell them to prepare for the fight of their lives. The message went out across human space at the speed of light, reaching every world and station and outpost where humanity had planted its flag, and on every one of those worlds, people looked up at the stars and felt something they had not felt since the day of their expulsion from the Concord. They felt hope. The Concord peacekeeping fleet emerged from hyperspace above the Tau Ceti system in perfect formation. 400 warships arranged in the ancient battle configurations that had proven effective for millennia. Admiral Vethlos of the Morthani stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Eternal Justice, a vessel so old that its weapons had last fired in anger. Before humanity discovered how to make fire, he expected to find chaos and panic below, expected desperate transmissions begging for mercy, expected the humans to realize at last that resistance against the combined might of the Concord was futile. Instead, his censor officer turned to him with confusion written across her gray features. Admiral, she reported hesitantly, I am detecting a single human vessel holding position at the edge of the system. A single vessel? Vethlos repeated slowly, certain he had misheard. Yes, sir, one ship, approximately 2 kilometers in length, broadcasting an identification signal that names it as the Defiance. Vethlos felt something stir in his ancient chest, an emotion he had not experienced in centuries and could not immediately identify. It was uncertainty. Show me, he commanded, and the main view screen shifted to display the human battleship hanging motionless against the stars. A dark angular shape that looked nothing like the elegant curves of Concord vessel design. They send one ship against our armada, his tactical officer muttered, and nervous laughter rippled through the bridge crew. They must be mad, or they know something we do not, Vethlos replied quietly, silencing the laughter instantly. Open a communication channel. The face that appeared on the view screen belonged to Admiral Marcus Chun, and Vethlos studied the human carefully, looking for signs of fear or desperation, and finding neither. Admiral Vethlos, Chun said calmly, you are in human space without invitation, and I am going to have to ask you to leave. More laughter from the bridge crew, louder this time, and even Vethlos allowed himself a thin smile at the absurdity of the demand. You cannot be serious, he said. I have 400 warships under my command, vessels that have enforced Concord law for thousands of years. And you have one ship. I am aware of the numbers, Chun replied, and something in his voice made the laughter die away. I am also aware that your fleet has not seen real combat in 800 years, that your crews run simulations against opponents who fight exactly like you do, and that your tactics have not changed since before my species developed writing. Vethlos felt his massive hands tighten on the command railing as anger replaced his earlier amusement. Is this meant to intimidate me? He demanded. No, Admiral, Chun said. And then he smiled in a way that made Vethlos remember why that emotion felt so unfamiliar. This is meant to educate you. He leaned forward slightly, and his next words were delivered with absolute conviction. Lesson 1. Never underestimate humanity. The Defiance moved. Vethlos had commanded warships for 3 centuries, had studied naval tactics for longer than most human civilizations had existed, and he had never seen anything move the way the human battleship moved in that moment. It did not form a battle line, as proper warships were supposed to do, did not exchange ranging shots to calibrate weapon systems, did not follow any of the protocols that defined civilized warfare. Instead, it simply attacked the Defiance, dove straight into the heart of the Concorde formation. Weapons blazing on frequencies that Morthani shields had never been calibrated to deflect. And the first 3 vessels died before anyone understood what was happening. "Return fire!" Vethlos roared, but his orders were lost in the chaos as the human ship twisted and spun through his fleet with impossible agility, striking at blind spots and formations that have been optimal for 10,000 years. The Concorde vessels tried to respond, tried to bring their superior numbers to bear. But every time they formed a firing solution, the Defiance was already gone, already attacking from a different angle, already exploiting weaknesses that should not have existed. Vethlos watched in horror as the proud warships of his fleet exploded one after another, victims of a style of warfare that none of them had ever encountered or prepared for. Human ship took hits of its own, shields flaring under the weight of concentrated fire. But it refused to slow down or retreat or do anything that a sensible commander would have done when facing such overwhelming odds. Instead, it fought harder. The battle lasted 17 minutes. And when it ended, the Defiance vanished into a quantum tunnel that should have been impossible to generate. So close to a star system's gravity, Welveth Lost stood surrounded by debris fields that had once been 63 of his warships, by emergency beacons screaming for rescue, by the shocked silence of a crew that had just witnessed the impossible. "Admiral," his communications officer whispered, "what do we do now?" Vethlos did not answer immediately because he did not have an answer to give. His fleet still outnumbered the humans overwhelmingly, still possessed more firepower than humanity could hope to match, still held every advantage that had allowed the Concorde to dominate the galaxy for 12,000 years. But for the first time in his long life, Vethlos understood that numbers alone would not be enough. The humans did not fight like civilized species were supposed to fight, did not follow the rules that had governed warfare since before the Concorde existed, did not seem to understand that there were things you simply did not do in battle. They were creative and unpredictable and utterly ruthless. And they had just humiliated the greatest military force in galactic history using a single ship. "Signal the Concorde High Command," Vethlos said finally, his voice heavy with implications he was only beginning to understand. "Tell them that we have engaged the humans. And tell them that we are going to need reinforcements." He paused and looked out at the wreckage floating past his view screen, at the funeral pyres of ships that had survived countless campaigns without a scratch. Many reinforcements. The war for human survival had truly begun, and the Concorde was about to learn that expelling humanity from their council had been the greatest mistake in their long and arrogant history. 2 years of war had transformed both humanity and the Galactic Concorde in ways that neither side could have predicted. When the conflict began, the elder races had committed more military resources to defeating humanity than they had deployed in any conflict for 3,000 years. And yet victory remained frustratingly out of reach. Admiral Chun stood in the war room of the mobile command station Resolute, studying holographic maps that showed the current state of the galaxy-spanning battlefield. "Report," he ordered without looking away from the strategic display. Commander Okafor stepped forward with his tablet and began reciting numbers that would have seemed impossible at the start of the war. Enemy losses this month include 47 capital ships, 112 cruisers, and support vessels beyond accurate count, he said. "We've also destroyed 3 major supply depots and crippled their logistics network in the outer rim sectors. And our losses? 12 capital ships, 31 cruisers," Okafor replied, his voice carrying the weight of those numbers. "The Indomitable and her crew are confirmed lost after the engagement at Kepler Station." Chung closed his eyes briefly in silent acknowledgement of the sacrifice. one of many that humanity had made and would continue to make until this war reached its conclusion. The Indomitable had held the Kepler passage against a Concorde fleet 10 times her size for 72 hours, buying time for civilian evacuations from the colonies beyond. And when her captain realized that escape was impossible, she had ordered her crew to detonate the reactor core. The explosion had taken a Concorde carrier group with them, and the survivors from the evacuated colonies would remember the name Indomitable for generations to come. The Concorde is calling another emergency session, his intelligence officer reported. Our sources indicate that the elder races are becoming increasingly divided over how to proceed. Chun allowed himself a small smile at that news, because division among his enemies was exactly what he had been working toward. Humanity could not match the Concorde in raw numbers or accumulated resources, so they had adopted a different strategy entirely, one that relied on speed and innovation and the willingness to take risks that the elder races considered unacceptable. Strike forces equipped with quantum tunnel drives materialized from empty space, devastated enemy convoys and installations, then vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Human agents infiltrated Concorde space stations and reprogrammed their automated defense systems to attack their own vessels, causing chaos and paranoia throughout enemy territory. Propaganda broadcasts pierced the Concorde information networks on frequencies they could not block, spreading doubt and fear among species who had been taught that humans were primitive and easily conquered. They adapt too quickly, the Silith Grand Admiral hissed during one of the many emergency Concorde sessions, her serpentine body coiling with frustration. Every countermeasure we develop, they overcome within weeks. Every trap we set, they escape. We have lost 11% of our combined fleet, and we have not taken a single human world. The Vethkai High Speaker's crystalline form flickered with agitation as it responded. Then we must commit more resources. Overwhelming force applied simultaneously to all human territories. We have committed overwhelming force. The Morthani delegate interrupted angrily. Humanity was supposed to be a minor species, easily subdued. And yet we have now devoted more military assets to this conflict than to any war in 3 millennia. How much more are we supposed to sacrifice? The cracks in Concorde unity grew wider with each passing month as member species began to question whether the cost of defeating humanity was worth the price they were paying. Meanwhile, humanity continued to grow stronger in ways the elder races could not comprehend. Every piece of captured Concorde technology was studied by teams of researchers who worked around the clock, improving upon designs that had remained unchanged for centuries and mass-producing the results in hidden shipyards scattered across human space. New weapon systems entered service almost monthly, each one more devastating than the last. And crews who had been raw recruits at the start of the war became hardened veterans capable of matching any Concorde force in combat. A generation of children had grown up knowing nothing but war, and they learned to fight with a ferocity that terrified even their own commanders. Commander David Okafor led the raid on the Morthani homeworld orbital ring that demonstrated humanity could strike anywhere it chose, not to conquer, but to send a message that no target was beyond their reach. Captain Lin Xiaoming earned immortality in the Kepler passage, and her final transmission was broadcast throughout human space as a reminder of what they were fighting for. "We do not surrender," she had said, as enemy weapons fire tore her ship apart around her. "We do not give up. We do not stop fighting until we have won or there are none of us left to fight." That is what it means to be human. Her words became a rallying cry that echoed across every human world, inspiring fresh waves of volunteers for the military and renewed determination among civilians who supported the war effort from behind the lines. The latest intelligence suggests that the Silith are considering withdrawal from the conflict. Chen's intelligence officer reported during a briefing. Their losses have been particularly severe, and there is growing political pressure on their government to seek a separate peace. And the others? Chen asked. The Morthani remain committed but are stretched thin across multiple fronts. The Vethkai are maintaining their position as war leaders, but losing influence daily. And at least 4 minor Concord members have already begun quiet negotiations with our diplomatic corps. Chen nodded slowly and turned back to the strategic display where human fleet positions glowed blue against the red markers of enemy forces. They were still outnumbered, still outgunned by traditional measures, still fighting against an alliance that had dominated the galaxy for longer than human civilization had existed. But the gap was closing. Every month brought new ships from the shipyards, new weapons from the research labs, new tactics from commanders, who had learned to think in ways the elder races could not anticipate. The Concord had expected a war of months against a primitive species that would quickly learn its place. Instead, they were fighting a war of generations against an enemy who refused to accept defeat no matter what the cost, and slowly, inexorably, inevitably, the tide was beginning to turn. The final battle took place above Veth Prime, the ancient heart of the Galactic Concord, where the crystal spires of the High Speaker's palace had stood for 12,000 years as a symbol of elder race dominance. Admiral Marcus Chun stood on the bridge of the humanity's resolve, flagship of a fleet that dwarfed anything the Concord had ever imagined possible from the species they had cast out as primitives barely a decade before. He was older now, his hair gray at the temples and scars crossing his face from close calls that had nearly ended his life during the long years of war. But his eyes still held the same fire that had burned in them on the day humanity received its sentence of expulsion. All ships report ready, Commander Okafor announced from the tactical station, and Chun could hear the barely contained excitement in his voice behind. The humanity's resolve stretched over 2,000 warships of every class, from massive Titan-class battleships to sleek destroyers to swarms of firecraft that filled the space between larger vessels like angry hornets. Each ship represented countless hours of labor and sacrifice. Each crew member had lost friends and family to the war, and every one of them had come to this place for the same purpose: to end it. The Concord Defense Fleet hung between them and Veth Prime, a final desperate gathering of every vessel the elder races could muster. But even at full strength, they were outnumbered nearly 2-to-1 by the human armada. Admiral, the communications officer said quietly, "We are receiving a transmission from the Concord flagship. They are requesting parley." Chun felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest as he gave the order to accept the transmission. The Vethkai High Speaker appeared on the main view screen, and Chun barely recognized the being who had pronounced sentence on humanity all those years ago. Crystalline form that had once pulsed with arrogant power was dim now, flickering with what might have been exhaustion or fear or both. And the voice that had condemned humanity carried none of its former certainty. "Admiral Chun," the High Speaker began, "we wish to discuss terms." Chun let the silence stretch for a long moment before he responded, remembering the chamber where Ambassador Vasquez had stood alone against the judgment of the galaxy, remembering the laughter that had greeted her question about refusal. "Terms," he repeated slowly, tasting the word. 12 years ago, you expelled humanity from the Galactic Concord. You called us primitive and dangerous. You threatened to dismantle our fleet and occupy our worlds. You gave us one rotation to comply with your demands. We were mistaken, the High Speaker admitted, and the words seemed to cost it physical pain. We did not understand what humanity was capable of. We did not anticipate the strength you would show. No, Chun agreed quietly. You did not. He stepped forward until he stood directly before the view screen, close enough that the High Speaker could see every scar on his face and read every emotion in his eyes. Here are our terms, he said, and his voice carried the weight of every human who had died in the war and every human who had survived. The Galactic Concord will be dissolved immediately and permanently. Every species currently under Concord Protectorate status will be granted full autonomy to govern themselves as they see fit. The elder races will return the territories they have claimed over the past 10,000 years to their original inhabitants. The High Speaker's form flickered violently as it processed these demands. You would destroy everything we have built? It asked, and genuine anguish colored its voice. 12,000 years of peace and order. 12,000 years of stability. You would tear it all down? Peace and order for whom? Chun replied, and there was no anger in his voice, only a tired certainty born of long experience. Stability for whom? The species you conquered and absorbed into your empire? The civilizations you crushed because they developed technology too quickly? The countless billions who lived under your rule with no voice and no choice? He shook his head slowly. That was not peace, High Speaker. That was control. And humanity will not allow it to continue. And what will you do? The High Speaker demanded. Will you become conquerors yourselves? Will you rule as we did, imposing your will on the galaxy through force? Chen was quiet for a moment, looking out through the view screen at the fleet behind him, at the world burning below where Concord defenders had chosen to fight rather than surrender, at the shattered remnants of the armada that had once been the greatest military force in galactic history. No, he said at last, we are not interested in ruling anyone. But we will never again allow a single group of species to dominate the galaxy through fear and stagnation. He turned back to face the High Speaker directly. The era of the Concord is over. What comes next we build together, all of us. Every species that wants to be part of a future where growth and change are celebrated rather than feared. The transmission ended. And within hours, the Concord High Command had accepted humanity's terms. There was no formal surrender ceremony, no humiliation of the defeated powers, no occupation of conquered territories, because that was not what humanity had fought for. Instead, there were negotiations and treaties and the slow, difficult work of building something new from the ashes of what had been. Destroyed the elder races retreated to their homeworlds to contemplate their defeat and adjust to a galaxy where they no longer held absolute power. The freed species emerged blinking into a future full of possibilities they had never been allowed to imagine, and many of them looked to humanity for guidance as they took their first uncertain steps toward self-determination. Humanity itself began the even harder task of deciding what kind of civilization they wanted to become now that survival was no longer their only concern. A century later, a young alien historian named Kithril of New Veth would write about the human emergence era, struggling to explain how a species so young and seemingly fragile had transformed the entire galaxy. The Galactic Concord made many mistakes in their dealings with humanity, Kithril wrote. But their greatest error was one of perception. They saw humans as a mere species, brief and fragile, to be controlled and contained. They did not understand that humanity's apparent weakness was in fact their greatest strength. When humanity was cast out, they did not despair, they built. When humanity was attacked, they did not surrender, they adapted. When humanity was underestimated, they did not resent it, they used it. The Concord expected humanity to break. They never understood. Humanity was forged by breaking, and in the great archives of the new Galactic Coalition, Ambassador Elena Vasquez's final diplomatic report was preserved as a reminder of how it all began. They asked me what would happen if we refused. She had written on the day of humanity's expulsion. I smiled because I already knew the answer. We would make them regret ever asking the question.